Good morning, everyone, and thanks, Jillian. As many of us know, there's a lot more to hosting technology than just putting it on a server. So this morning, I'm going to talk about our hosting program at Scholars Portal, where we host library publishing technology. I've been in my role for a few years now, and have been reflecting a lot on what goes into software hosting services. So my hope today is to talk, with today's talk, is to reflect on what goes into technology hosting, what kind of workflows we're using, how we make certain decisions, and ultimately the best practices that we can work towards within the resources that we have. So while the things I'm going to cover are about library publishing services, they can be applied to other technologies as well. So to get started, I'm going to give you some background on our publishing services at Scholars Portal. So the Public Knowledge Project, or PKP, develops open source publishing software. So two of the main applications that they develop are OJS, or Open Journal Systems, and OMP, or Open Monograph Press. And these tools are used for journal and monograph publishing. They're both built with PHP and have very similar user interfaces as well. So at Scholars Portal, we provide hosting services, subscription-based hosting services for OJS and OMP to Ontario universities. Our hosting service began in 2012 and has since grown up to 11 universities across Ontario, which collectively host over 125 journals. So we host and manage the software on behalf of the universities, who then run their own individual publishing programs. And each institution has its own instance of the software. This service is supported by myself, another librarian, as well as a system support specialist. So alongside hosting the software, we also do troubleshooting and technical support, sponsored Crossref memberships so that people can mint DOIs. We host an instance of Matomo Analytics, which we just started doing recently, and we also do some theming and customization work. So now that you have a bit of background, I'd like to talk about the growth of the service and some of the issues that we've faced. We've gone from 1 to 11 institutions over the last 7 years of the service. So as the service has grown, we've had to find ways to ensure that we're finding a balance between doing things in a sustainable way, providing good service to the libraries, and managing the workload of our own team alongside other projects that we have going on at Scholars Portal. So while the core of the service is technology hosting, we do spend the most time on client support. So in order to manage our workloads effectively, we use a shared email address for everyone to contact us directly so that we can balance out support questions depending on what each of us is working on. And we also use a ticketing system, Jira in our case, so that we can track issues that come up. And within Jira, we're also doing time tracking. So this has been really helpful to know how much time we're spending with each institution, and as well as what kinds of issues we're spending the most time on, and it can be really useful data to have for evaluating pricing models if you're charging for services, and to evaluate if you have enough resources. So one thing we found really important for providing client support is to ensure that roles and responsibilities are clearly defined. So this includes for us as Scholars Portal, as well as the librarians and journal managers and editors. It's really important to establish these roles early on if you can, because it's really hard to roll back. So we've had cases where editors will start to contact us directly for support, and then we have to kind of roll back that relationship, which can be really challenging to do. So defining roles is easy, redefining them is very hard. We also try to encourage people to get involved in the broader journal hosting communities, if they're not already doing so. So things like mailing lists, Slack channels, forums. So this is especially valuable because we don't always have the answer to every question that comes up. So for example, journals want to know, well, how can I get my journal into the directory of open access journals? But this is not something that we tend to work with at Scholars Portal. So having that community to draw from is really valuable. So now that I've talked a bit about the client support side, I'd like to talk about code management. So with OJS, updating is a very manual process, and it's not automatic. So we have to be really mindful about when and why we are doing our updates. With 11 different schools, it's really time consuming, as you can imagine. So this is something that we'd like to improve on in the future with one shared code repository, but we just haven't gotten there yet. So when thinking about our code updates, we try to work closely with institutions and monitor the latest developments from PKP so that we can make judgment calls about when to upgrade. So some of the things that we might think about include, are there security issues? Because obviously that becomes a higher priority upgrade. What are the new features in this release? And is it something that somebody's been requesting for a while? Is it a minor or major release, which is going to affect, how much time we're going to spend on it? And are there any bugs either in the current release that we're running with or this new release that we want to go up to? So the other side of code management is customizations. Sometimes institutions will request individual customizations for their instances. And in the past, while we've allowed for a lot of customizations, as the service has grown, it becomes very complex. So it's important to remember that every code customization that you do has a cost associated with it. You're going to have to reapply that or remerge those changes every single time that you do an update. So with all of that in mind, we're trying to rethink also how we handle our customizations. So some of the things that we think about here include, if this can be useful to the larger project community. So if we can submit it back as a pull request to the PKP code base, then that's, it helps us and helps other users. We also look at how large of a change it is. If it's something that's in one file or if it touches many of the core files within OJS, then it makes it more complicated. And lastly, we look at where the code lives. So OJS and OMP have what is called submodules. So for those that are not familiar with these, it's where a Git repository is like pulling in code from a different Git repository, but that repository is managed somewhere else. So we don't host our own version of these submodules in Git. So if the customization would affect those files, then it needs to be something that we can do as a pull request. Back to PKP's core code. So the next piece of this I'd like to talk about are environments and deployment processes. So in the past, we've done our test upgrades locally, but as the services have grown, we can't always do these on our own machine. When you're doing 11 different upgrades and you only have so much hard drive space. So it's a bit of a challenge. So we've started using development environments that allow us to test upgrades and to open up testing to users before we update production. And plus it allows us to test out all of our custom work. Of course, it's important to make sure that a development environment is set up properly so that it's not, doing things like sending out emails or other data, that it's, IP restricted properly so that users aren't finding it accidentally or it's not being harvested by something else. And then in our production environment, we've recently moved from having individual servers for all of our OJS instances to having one shared server. We did this when we recently upgraded to OJS 3, and it works for OJS because it's not overall that resource intensive. So this is a snapshot of our deployment documentation for OJS. So in the past, we've relied on really lengthy documents that outline the different steps in the upgrade process. And if you've ever been responsible for managing hosted software, this might be familiar to you. So the problem with this is, of course, that it's very prone to human error. It can be really easy to enter something incorrectly. And while we do have backups in place, it adds a lot of time to the upgrade process. So we've started to use a tool called Jenkins, which is an automation server for deploying code and automating tasks. So at Scholars Portal, we use this for a lot of different services, and we've recently started using this for OJS as well. So this turns those lengthy deployment documents into a relatively nice user interface. So we have a drop-down menu that allows us to select what instance we're going to upgrade. We can pick the code branch that we're using. We have checkboxes for pulling in the latest database from our production environment, and another for if we want to run the upgrade script. So we're currently doing this in our dev environment and are hoping to roll it out to production soon. So the last aspect of this that I'd like to talk about is community contribution. So I'd like to touch on, getting involved in the larger project and community for the service, which really helps us scale across many institutions. So in the case of our publishing services, this means finding ways to contribute back to PKP's work. So this can include things like being engaged in PKP's forums. So sometimes we'll send users there to ask questions, and it's only, it's good for us to give back when we can. As I mentioned before, contributing code back, or, sometimes documentation as well. Being involved with working groups and communities across PKP, so it allows us to, help out there, but also sometimes have a say in new features or the direction that the software is going. A more obvious one is contributing financially back to PKP. So we've been lucky in Ontario in that many institutions have been able and willing to support PKP financially. And lastly, another way that we can support scaling scholarly infrastructure is by supporting broader initiatives in this area. So some of you may be familiar with the Invest in Open project. So from their website, the mission of Invest in Open is to enable durable, scalable, and thriving open scientific and scholarly infrastructure, serving the needs of global communities. While this is still a fairly new initiative, this is one example of how we can more broadly support efforts towards more sustainable and scalable scholarly infrastructure. Thank you for your attention.
So we do have time for some questions, if we have any from the audience. So I'll start a little bit. I'm interested to know how the conversation shifted, sort of from allowing customization to being more thoughtful about it. Was that a challenging conversation to have with your community?
I think in general, people have understood, where we're coming from. As long as I think you're transparent about it and explain why you're doing this, then I don't think it's really been a challenge. Sometimes, we might have to find a workaround if there's, very particular use case, but in general, it hasn't been a challenge for us.
Any other questions from the audience? The mics are available to you in the room, so I'll ask that you use them if you have a question. In that case, let's thank Kaitlin for her great talk.